Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to this short lecture reflection as part of our preparation for the process of encountering communities that represent other religious faiths than our own and beginning to learn what it means for us, firstly, to encounter people who are other than ourselves, and what that means for our capacity to listen and provide dignified and appropriate and compassionate spiritual care to those who are different from us. And what are some of the practical things we can learn about others as well, in terms of what they might require for us if we were to encounter them in a secular context, such as a hospital or an aged care facility or a prison or a school. How might we be able to become more aware of the way people of other faiths may be more deeply and authentically cared for by us? So that's what we're about in this unit, and that's what I thought we'd reflect a little bit about in this lecture. And I thought I'd begin by just getting stuck into some of the elements of the reading that I shared with you from this book, Encountering Religion, which is a textbook edited by Ian Markham and Tina Reparo. And they've put together a great textbook here that's very, very open and quite thoughtful in its approach to multi-religious, multi-faith encounter. That's why I've given you the readings. And I just thought we would, in particular, spend a little bit of time reflecting on the three main approaches that they've outlined to interfaith or multi-faith encounter. Before I go on, let's just spend a moment talking about that terminology, the difference between the terminology of multi-faith and interfaith. We've very deliberately used the terminology of multi-faith in this unit, precisely because what we are doing in this is not so much an attempt at dialogue, but an attempt at encounter, true encounter, that enables listening and spiritual care. If we were attempting a form of dialogue or comparative engagement with between faiths that might seek greater understanding or to do some shared theology with other faiths and so on, then we might call it multi-faith, in that sense that there are a multiplicity of views and faiths and understandings seeking conversation together in that way. We are not attempting to do that in this unit. We're attempting to have an authentic encounter with those who are different to ourselves. We are attempting to understand what it means for us to enable the other to be other. In that sense, we are celebrating diversity and the approach to deep listening and human encounter that celebrates that diversity. And so that's why we're deliberately using the language of multi-faith, so to emphasise the diversity of otherness in this approach, which is deeply valuable to human life and indeed to the richness of culture and spirituality that we are wanting to contribute to. So the three different approaches that the authors have identified are not the only approaches, but they're common approaches to the study of religion, but also to the encounter that occurs between religious faiths often, or between, for example, anthropologists and sociologists and religious communities and so on. I'm sipping a coffee while I go. Feel free to pause and go and grab one for yourself. It helps me get going. So these three approaches that the authors have identified are the phenomenological approach, the confessional approach, and the empathetic approach. And these three approaches all are said to be common in the process of encountering other faiths. And the authors really, I think, and what I'm wanting to do here is point to the complexity of the debate rather than the simplisticness or simplicity of the debate around these three approaches, because I think the authors have outlined reasonably well these three approaches, but in the pursuit of their argument, they have been a bit simplistic, particularly in relation to the phenomenological approach, and I want us to spend some time reflecting on that. I think it's quite clear that we can see the limitations of the confessional approach, the approach to another faith that comes from a deep confessional conviction that my own religious faith is the only approach to truth, and that in order to encounter another faith, that encounter must consist of the attempt to convince the other of the efficacy and the truth of my own confessional approach. And that's a whole conversation around that approach that perhaps we need to have at another time, and that has already come up in conversation in various classroom encounters that we've had. But we're not going to stay with that today. I just wanted you to hold that. And if that confessional approach is deeply present in your own sense of how you might normally approach this, then stay with it, read through that material and do some more research into it. I think I love the idea of the empathetic approach and the way the authors have detailed that. The idea that in order to have an authentic encounter and to truly understand the other, one needs to get close. One needs to, in fact, go and be close to the other, which is precisely what we're doing. So in a sense, this whole unit is built around the empathetic approach to encountering those of other religious faiths. We don't make assumptions about them. We don't make judgments standing afar off. We actually go and get close. We do what is called what I call constructing meaning through proximity, through actually going and finding out. And this is the methodology that we glean from the wonderful life and work of the French philosopher Simone Weil, who I often talk about, who did not think it was sufficient to theorise about people, but rather thought that it was absolutely part of her task as a philosopher to observe through proximity, through actually going and being with, being close to those whom she was writing about. And so, as we know, she left her job as a teacher and she went and worked in the Renault factory, where she was wanting to find out firsthand whether the proletariat were in fact thinking about and talking about social and political and cultural revolution. And what she discovered was that they were too busy surviving to even think about things like grand ideas of revolution and communist ideologies and so on and so forth. And so she actually was able to discover firsthand for herself who these people are that she was talking about, and not rely on her assumptions and her ideologies and her beliefs. And I'll say it again, and I keep saying it, there's nothing like a real encounter with a real human person for exploding our theories and ideas, and that's very much a principle that underlies what we're doing in this unit. So the confessional approach has profound limitations that we're aware of. The empathetic approach is really, as it's stated in the reading, a beautiful approach and very much at the heart of what we're attempting here. That leaves the phenomenological approach, which is somewhat dismissed by the authors as being an approach that leads us to cold, observant objectivity. The idea that we can somehow bracket our assumptions, our ideas, our prejudices about the other in our observation of them. In other words, we can somehow leave ourselves out of it and just do some kind of scientific analysis of the other person. Now, if that's what phenomenology is, absolutely, we don't want to do things that way. We are not engaging in this unit in order to undertake a scientific analysis of people from other religious faiths. We're not going to do charts, and we're not going to do statistics on them, and we're not going to try and come up with evidence-based research that proves a particular point, any of that sort of stuff. We're actually in this to have a deep personal encounter with the other and understand what it means for us to be able to listen with and to the other. And that's a very personal formation process. It's not a cold, objective observation of someone who is different to us. But my question is that in fact all that phenomenology is? That's certainly one way that phenomenology can be understood, but the study of phenomenology is a complex process and phenomenology means a bunch of different things. And I want to invite you to consider that for us as people who are researching spiritual care, particularly as spiritual care practitioners, but also as counsellors and psychologists and ministers and others who seek to understand what it means to listen to the other in this way, we can draw on the tradition of phenomenology in a very particular way that is very deeply helpful for us. So I just very simply, and somewhat simplistically no doubt, want to invite you to understand some of the intent behind the phenomenologists of mid-last century. Their intent was to see if we could begin with a clean slate, as it were, in the sense that often always when we encounter something in experience, in our immediate experience, we interpret that encounter with all of our lenses, the lenses of our own experiences. And these lenses are not only ideologies or cultural patterns or sociological structures, but they are also lenses that are embedded in our physiology based on the experiences that we've had in our various environments throughout our development as human beings. So when we encounter one another and when we encounter situations, when we have experiences, it's sometimes very difficult to know whether we are interpreting them correctly. Is our interpretation of our experience in this context, for example, accurate? And we all know that if you ask 5 different witnesses of a car accident what happened, you'll get 5 slightly different interpretations of what happened. So what did actually happen? And phenomenology is an attempt, and it is quite an idealist attempt, to put in brackets all of those lenses through which we interpret our experiences. In a sense, to put my own prejudices and lenses and understandings of the world over here for a moment and make an attempt to experience the event or the person or the situation as it is given to me directly, without the mediation of all of these other lenses. Now, as the authors of our reading have said, that sounds a bit idealistic, and it's quite a difficult thing to know whether it's even possible. But I want you to hear the intent behind that, particularly when it comes to interpersonal encounters. So often, when we encounter another human person, before we have even opened our mouths, before we have even made any conscious engagement, social interaction or engagement with that person, we have made layers and layers and layers of judgments, discernments, formed ideas, made assumptions about them that will frame and define the way we encounter them, the way we actually approach them, whether or not we are able to hear them and listen to them properly. So phenomenology for the caring professions, the listening professions, phenomenology invites us to consider that in fact when we encounter the other, we might actually be able to make an attempt to receive them for who they actually are, as they actually are, and to listen in ourselves for what our immediate felt experience of the other is, rather than what our pre-formed judgments, prejudices, understandings would lead us to believe. So, for example, I might, on the basis of various different narratives that I've been listening to, on the basis of the dialogue that I'm accustomed to in my family of origin, on the basis of various racial profiling and stereotypes that I understand through the media, when I approach a particular group of people or a person from a particular country or cultural group, I might have some preconceptions that they are arrogant, or perhaps that they are given to violence, that they have lower social and cultural standards than I have. They have less attachment to their children or family. And in all of these prejudices, these sort of micro-racist attitudes that I've developed, I will approach a person from that particular cultural background with those lenses in place, sometimes unconsciously, without even knowing it. If I become aware of those things in myself, if I'm able to actually say to myself, well, I know I am racist. I know that by virtue of the fact that I am a white middle-class male in a Western country, I am part of the most powerful demographic in the world, and I know that by virtue of the fact that I am surrounded with a white culture dominated by males, I will have imbibed within myself some intrinsically racist perspectives, some lenses that I, even without thinking about it in a pre-conscious way, will apply to my encounter with other people. Now I've taken the first step to listening, if I'm able to actually recognise that in myself. I'll never forget a radio conversation about racism that I heard when I was in Canberra. And people were talking about racist attitudes, and mostly when we talk about racism, we assume that everyone else is racist and I'm not racist. And a woman rang, and I listened intently to her, because the first thing she said was, I just want to ring in to say that I'm racist. And there was kind of flawed silence, And she said, you need to understand that by reaching that self-understanding, I've taken the first step towards changing my attitudes, towards encountering people differently to what I would if I was not aware of those lenses that are part of my life. And I was just blown away by her courage in stating it in that way. And I think that she was right, that the first step towards a phenomenological approach is self-awareness. It's not so much pretending that I can put all those things away, but it is in fact acknowledging that they are part of who I am, that they are part of the way I view the world without consciously deciding to, because I am embedded in my culture, I'm embedded in my social context, I'm embedded in my political context, I'm embedded in my religious community context. And so there are certain ways that I think about and encounter others that I'm not even aware of. So step number one in the phenomenological approach then is to listen to myself, to become aware of who I am, how I'm approaching this situation, and what kind of lenses I might be placing between myself and the other as I come to that encounter. I wonder how you're going with this, and whether you're starting to apply the phenomenological approach to yourself yet, even as we speak. So this it really reveals for us that the common maxim, you can't listen to someone else if you can't listen to yourself, is in fact very phenomenological. It's very much part of that process. We first seek to understand ourselves so that we can work towards a genuine encounter with the other. And the next step, after we become aware of ourselves, is the step of receiving the other as they are. And this is why phenomenology is called phenomenology. The other, in this moment, in this time, in this context, right now, is the phenomenon that I receive and want to receive as they are, now, as I experience them. And so listening to my own felt experience in the encounter is in fact at the heart of the phenomenological approach as I would want to present it to you. When the other receives me and I enter into an inter-human encounter with them, what I am listening for is what's happening right now, what's actually happening. So my lenses might say, oh, these particular types of people are violent. but my actual lived experience in the moment is of a warm, hospitable, welcoming human person. And the phenomenological approach says, pay attention to what you are experiencing right now. Yes, you have all these other lenses. They are still part of you. They're part of who you are. But be aware of them and pay attention to your actual lived experience of the other as they are given to you in the present moment. And that leads to an extraordinary possibility that has been named by the phenomenologists and by various psychologists as intersubjectivity. And that is that in the moment where two human persons encounter one another, something occurs between them when they allow one another to be other in genuine human encounter. Both of them bring themselves in a radical openness to the possibilities of what will emerge in this encounter that will be unique. No other encounter will hold what this encounter will hold now in this present moment. And when two human beings approach one another in that way, and mutual listening occurs, and mutual affirmation, and a mutual receptiveness to what is real in the actual moment, what is really occurring in the moment. When this occurs, we call it a truly intersubjective encounter. We have two human persons with a strong sense of who they are themselves, bringing themselves in generosity to encounter one another, allowing each other to be other and to truly relate to one another. Now, you may well have heard of Martin Buber, the wonderful Jewish philosopher who is famous for articulating this particular kind of encounter in his book, I and Thou. The other wonderful author who articulates this for us, particularly in the pastoral and spiritual care sense, is Pamela Cooper-White, who's on your reading list. Shared Wisdom is a wonderful analysis of what intersubjectivity is, what it could be, and how it relates to our capacity to listen to one another. So I don't want you, with the authors of the Encountering Religion book, to too quickly dismiss the study of phenomenology. I encourage you to read more deeply the work of the phenomenologists. It's pretty heavy going, pardon me, at times. It can be pretty heavy going, but it's worth the hard work. And I would recommend to you Martin Buber, I would recommend to you Emmanuel Levinas, I would recommend to you Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Simone Weil. These are outstanding authors, and they all build on the work of Edmund Husserl, who was the perhaps in a sense the first modern phenomenologist as we understand phenomenology. I would encourage you to employ the phenomenological approach as I have articulated it for you, as you employ the empathetic approach in your encounters with those of other faiths, other religions, and other spiritualities. I really do want and hope the best for you as you go out into these various different wonderful faith communities and offer them the generosity of your true presence. Offer them the generosity of receiving them as they are, of attempting to set aside, or at least, at the very least, be critically aware of your own prejudices, fears, anxieties, lenses that can easily come between you and stop you from truly encountering the other. Go gently with yourselves. Engage in conversation. Use the supervision and enjoy the encounters and learn. Go well.